Mediterranean, there were a variety of small religious groups of various kinds. Many of them had leaders who had recently died in some form or another. And many of them proclaimed that their leader had come back, had been raised from the dead. So when the disciples hear from Peter, in one version of the resurrection story, or Mary Magdalene in another, or the other two Marys in yet a third version of the resurrection, when they hear that the tomb is empty, they're confused. They're not sure what to make of it. Not at first. And if you remember, when Jesus is put to death, the authorities make sure that there's a guard at the tomb because they know this is an old trick, steal the body. So then, a few days later, the religious group who's associated with this person can claim he's been raised from the dead. There's a difference, of course, between the story of Jesus and the story of Mithras and a number of these other gods or leaders who their religions claim were raised from death. Those leaders wanted to be conquering heroes. This leader, remember, entered Jerusalem not on a war horse, but on a donkey. Those leaders were all about dividing the world into two and rewarding the people that were loved by those leaders. This leader preached forgiveness and reconciliation and acceptance of all. This was a leader who was known for healing people and teaching love and reaching out to people that others rejected, even going to the tombs where the most despised people were forced to live. This Jesus, this resurrection, was completely different. This was not the kind of person who was supposed to be raised from the dead. How do we make sense of the resurrection? Preachers have been trying to do that for 2,000 years. Theologians have argued with one another over different points about the resurrection. Churches have divided over questions about the resurrection. Is the resurrection some magical deal where God buys off the devil or tricks the devil? Those were two popular ideas in the Middle Ages. I think there are some people that still believe that sort of stuff. Is the resurrection the final act of a sort of bloodletting that makes God happy because he sees his son suffer? There are certainly people that believe that. I would suggest from what we just heard in the gospel and from the other accounts of the resurrection and from what we heard from the reading from Acts today, that the resurrection is God's vindication of Jesus, who he was, how he lived, what he taught, the kind of life he embodied. It's no surprise that the church has said through the centuries that Jesus Christ was fully human. That full humanity that he lived stands almost as a question mark in the midst of our own lives, and that has through the centuries. What do we make of the resurrection? It is the vindication of Jesus. It is an invitation to those who knew Jesus and to you and I who know Jesus through the stories and experiences of others, and finally through our own experience. It is an indication and an invitation to us to follow this one whose life and death has been vindicated by God. And notice what happens at the beginning of the story. Almost all these stories of the resurrection, the stone is rolled away. And you would expect the stone to roll away and then Jesus to walk out. But that's not what happens. Jesus is already gone in all of these resurrection stories. The stone is rolled away not so that Jesus can walk out into life, but so that the disciples, so Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved, or in Matthew's gospel, the two Marys can actually walk in the tomb and see that there is nothing there in the midst of death. walk into the darkness of death and see that death finally has no power, not over the love, not over the compassion of someone who lives life fully in God's presence. The stone was rolled away not to let Jesus out, but to let us in on the secret of the gospel, that our faith is in a way of life, vindicated by God, lived by Jesus, proclaimed by us in church on Sunday, but in our lives day by day, a way of life that we choose to follow because we have found something that makes sense for us. And what's fascinating about these stories of the resurrection is there's always an angel that says, do not be afraid. Confidence. Confidence in God's presence is what those who come to the tomb are asked to share. What does it mean for us to live with confidence? I remember in a class where I was reading church history, reading about the English Reformation and Cromwell's New Model Army, and one of the things they were doing was, of course, fighting the established church, but they were also looking for people that they considered to be heretical. And at one point they found a Quaker man and they accused him of not believing in the resurrection. They put him on trial and they said, do you not believe that Jesus came forth from the dead? Do you not believe in the resurrection? And his answer was, I believe in resurrection because it happens in my life. They missed the point, of course. Put him to death because maybe they missed the point about resurrection. An insight that young man had. Confidence in God's presence. A number of years ago, I was able to travel to Romania with a traveling seminar from the seminary that I attended in Chicago. And it was 1 year to the week after a horrible earthquake hit Romania and buckled a number of buildings in downtown Bucharest. You have to understand that during the Easter season, people are always greeting one another. Even in Romania then, when it was a communist country, everybody was always greeting one another, Christos anesti, Christ is risen. And people respond, he is risen indeed. And this earthquake hit during Lent, when you're not supposed to be saying those things. And the emergency teams were pulling dead bodies out of the rubble, and about 4 days after the earthquake, when most people had written off the possibility of any survivors, 3 people on their way to work heard a cry in the midst of some rubble and went over and moved some pieces of rubble, and a young woman struggled through the debris and came out and stood up and embraced the 3 who set her free. And they greeted one another, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. And by then, of course, a crowd had gathered around and they began to sing an Easter hymn. And the government workers who came to make sure that she was okay medically joined them in the hymn. Confidence in the presence of a God who sets us free wherever we are trapped. The tomb, when it is full, like the tombs of our lives, the tomb is about fear and the misuse of power and anxiety and all those things that keep us down and teach us to deny ourselves. Why is it that we give fear and anxiety power over our lives? Why is it that we are so motivated by moments of anxiety and dread that we're unable to see the emptiness of the tomb? Where is our trust? No easy answers. I'm not here to give you those kinds of platitudes. I'm simply asking a question. When Peter and the other disciple entered the tomb, They discovered that everything that they feared in life was gone, empty, powerless. And they had the promise that they would see again the one who set them free. The angels are constantly telling the people that come to the tomb in all the different resurrection stories that Christ was going before them into Galilee, and they would go back home, in other words. That's what Galilee was. These were people who lived in Galilee. They didn't belong in Jerusalem. And so the message is, go home, and there you will meet the risen Christ. There, in our daily lives, we too will encounter the risen Christ. The resurrection, you see, is not so much a doctrine, not so much some idea that we say, yeah, that's a good idea. It is a lifestyle. It is a path that we are invited to walk. I've made a few references to the fact that there are a variety of resurrection stories, and I have friends, atheists, militant atheists, Muslims, and others who say, well, you know, the problem with Christianity is you can't even get the resurrection story straight. This is the most important story for Christians, and Matthew has a version, and Mark has a version, and Luke has a version, and John has a version, and Paul has a version. And there are all these different people and all these different versions. How can you believe any of that? Well, I don't know how to answer the question about history. Although I've always found the variety in Scripture to be a strength rather than a weakness. But what I do know is that the early church, those early followers of Jesus, the apostles, the men and the women, all those different people who are represented by the people who go to the garden and stand at the open door of the tomb, those people experienced something happening, which they call resurrection. They experienced the risen Christ in their lives when they returned to their workaday world and discovered that everything that they treasured about this person who was put to death was still alive and still present and still bringing forgiveness and compassion and faith and hope into their lives. They knew the power of resurrection. And you do too. Anytime there is a life that is marred by bad mistakes or destructive choices that begins to see a way of turning to goodness and justice, there the light of resurrection shines. Anytime there's a crack in the closet door, enough to let a little bit of light shine in so that someone finds their dignity, there the light of resurrection shines. Every time we move from a life of anxiety and fear to a life of trust and hope, there we experience resurrection. Any time that we're willing to set aside our cynicism and our apathy and embrace the good news, the challenge, the invitation that is part of the good news that calls us to be not only persons transformed, but a transformative community, then we know what the resurrection is about. The Christian life is all about resurrection. Living aware that the power of death does not have the last word. For us as Christians, as for the early church, resurrection was not so much something that was going to happen off in the distance, in the future. It was something that began right here, right now, with the way that we care for one another, empty tomb in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. It is about the empty tombs awaiting us in our own lives. It is about following Jesus and sharing the faith